Some crimes leave no fingerprints, only reflections that refuse to fade. Our story begins in the cold heart of Europe, where a silver mask, forged in deceit, unravels the pride of an empire and tests the conscience of the world's keenest mind. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, follow me back to Baker Street, where the fire still glows and truth flickers faintly upon the tarnished edge of silver. It was one of those dim and soundless London mornings when the very air seems weighted with fatigue. The fog, heavy and unmoving, pressed against the window panes of Baker Street as though it sought entrance. Within our familiar sitting room, the fire burned low, sending occasional sparks into the gloom. My companion sat before it in his armchair, his long, lean figure bowed, his chin resting upon his steepled fingers. He had been silent for nearly an hour, save for the faint rustle of the newspaper he had cast aside, and I knew from experience that this particular stillness was not idleness, but incubation. Holmes's mind, when so at rest, was never truly still. Outside, the dull clang of a distant hansom and the occasional cry of a newsboy broke the monotony. I had begun to suspect that the day would end as uneventfully as it had begun, when a sharp rap upon the door announced the arrival of a visitor. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, her expression tinged with curiosity, and handed Holmes a sealed envelope of thick cream paper, upon which gleamed the unmistakable crest of Austria. The contrast between its dignified seal and the soot-streaked fingers that carried it struck me as peculiarly symbolic of London itself, an empire of grime concealing threads that bound the wider world. "A diplomatic hand," murmured Holmes, examining the seal without yet breaking it. "Austrian, mid-level attaché and recent correspondence. The wax is still warm." The courier, a uniformed young man whose breath hung in the cold air, stood stiffly in the doorway. "For Mr. Sherlock Holmes, sir," he said in a tone that suggested a mixture of duty and awe. Holmes inclined his head. Moments later, we were alone again, the faint scent of travel clinging to the paper like an unspoken history. Holmes broke the seal with care, his eyes skimming the page swiftly before reading aloud in his precise, unemotional cadence. From Baron Ernst von Lutz, attaché to the Imperial Embassy of His Majesty, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. The Baron requests the private counsel of Mr. Sherlock Holmes of London in a matter of great delicacy and consequence, namely, the disappearance of an artifact of national significance known as the Silver Mask of Vienna. The Baron implores absolute discretion, as the loss, if revealed, may endanger more than honour. Holmes's voice faltered for a heartbeat at that final line. He folded the letter neatly and placed it upon the mantel. "A curious turn of phrase, Watson," said he, at last. "When a man fears the loss of honour more than the loss of an empire, it is not the artifact that troubles him. It is what that artifact conceals." He rose then, pacing lightly across the rug, his sharp eyes travelling once more over the letter. "Note the choice of words," he said. "He does not report the theft, he implores assistance. There is humility in the tone, the kind born not of virtue but of fear. Observe also the tremor in the penmanship. A nervous man, accustomed to ceremony, not to desperation." Holmes held the envelope to the light. Viennese paper, hand-cut, and yet the seal was applied in London. Our Baron, it seems, writes under the shadow of proximity. He is already here. He placed the letter gently beside the Persian slipper upon the mantelpiece and turned toward the window, where the dim outline of carriage wheels traced themselves through fog. "We are to have a visitor this evening, Watson, a man who carries both empire and guilt upon his shoulders. There are moments when I have felt that my friend's cases form a hidden chronicle of Europe's conscience. In the years of my association with him, I had seen ambassadors tremble before his deductions, generals plead for secrecy, and monarchs entrust to him what they would never have confided to their own courts. It struck me then that crime, as Holmes understood it, was seldom local. It was the expression of weakness or greed, magnified by power. As I watched him now, his figure sharp against the fire's dull glow, I realized how naturally he moved in that strange twilight, where diplomacy met deceit. For Holmes, a case was not measured in its reward, but in the intricacy of the mind that wove it. And this Baron von Lutz, with his plea wrapped in ceremony, promised a web both political and personal. "The matter will not wait," said Holmes decisively, consulting his watch. "If he fears scandal more than justice, he will come tonight, and alone." I offered a word of caution, reminding him that embassies and political intrigues often concealed dangers beyond mere theft. Holmes smiled faintly. "My dear Watson, it is not danger that concerns me, but the motive that courts it. There are masks which reveal more than they conceal, and this one, I suspect, was made of silver for a reason." He drew the curtains, lit his pipe, and leaned back into his chair, the faint blue tendrils of smoke rising toward the ceiling like the ghosts of half-formed thoughts. "At 7 precisely," he said quietly, "we shall meet our Baron." As dusk settled upon Baker Street, the city's murmur dimmed to a restless whisper. A pale lamplight flickered against the fog, and within the room, the clock's ticking marked each moment of waiting. Holmes sat immobile, his gaze fixed upon the door, the ember of his pipe glowing faintly in the gloom. I confess that an inexplicable unease had crept upon me. Perhaps it was the atmosphere, the sense of a hidden hand reaching across nations to our quiet hearth. Or perhaps it was the look in Holmes's eyes, not of excitement, but of foreboding. When at last the sound of a carriage halted outside, Holmes stirred. "Our man has arrived," he said simply. "And with him, I fear, the first breath of a larger storm." The firelight wavered, and in that fragile moment of silence before the knock came, I felt the weight of something vast pressing at our very door. It was nearing 7 when the low rumble of carriage wheels broke the hush of the street below. The sound drew nearer, then stopped, followed by the measured tap of footsteps, hesitant, deliberate, as though the visitor weighed every pace before committing to it. Holmes looked up from his armchair, where the thin spiral of smoke from his pipe curled lazily toward the ceiling. "There, Watson," he murmured. "We have the tread of anxiety, light, but rhythmically uneven. It is the step of a man who hopes not to be seen." I listened more closely, and indeed there was in that footfall an air of restraint rather than haste. The bell rang softly, a single chime. Mrs. Hudson's voice echoed faintly from the hall, and moments later the sound of a coat being removed and cautious tones exchanged told us that our expected visitor, or rather, our anxious one, had arrived. The door opened, and Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall gentleman, whose appearance instantly drew the eye. His hair was of iron grey, brushed carefully back, his moustache trimmed in the continental fashion. His attire, though of the finest cut, bore the marks of a hurried journey. "Baron von Lutz," he introduced himself, his accent tinged with the inflection of the Danube. He bowed stiffly, and I noted how the gloved hands that held his hat trembled ever so slightly. The man's composure was that of one trained to conceal emotion, yet his pallor betrayed a recent and heavy strain. Holmes gestured courteously toward the armchair opposite. "You have come a long way, Baron," he said, "and not for pleasure, I think." Von Lutz's lips moved faintly in acknowledgement. "For discretion, Mr. Holmes, and perhaps for redemption." After a brief pause, during which he appeared to marshal his courage, the Baron began his account in a low, deliberate voice. "The matter concerns the silver mask of Vienna," said he. "It is the most venerated relic of our imperial collection, a ceremonial gift, centuries old, symbolizing unity between crown and people. 2 nights ago it was stolen from a locked case within the Austrian embassy itself." Holmes's brows lifted slightly. "From within the embassy? A bold enterprise, Baron, one that presumes not only access, but privilege. The Baron inclined his head. Precisely. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken lock, no disturbance of the surrounding artifacts. The disappearance is known only to 3 persons: the ambassador, myself, and one other whom I fear is beyond confession. He paused, his eyes darkening. For the man who last handled the mask is already dead. Holmes leaned forward, his gaze fixed upon our visitor. And yet, Baron, I take it the loss has not yet become public knowledge. Von Lutz gave a faint, mirthless smile. Because the case is not empty, Mr. Holmes. A mask remains within it, indistinguishable from the original, even under scrutiny. It gleams, it weighs, it deceives. Only the trained eye of our late curator suspected its imposture. I confess, I shivered at the thought of that perfect counterfeit, an imitation so flawless it might pass for truth itself. Holmes, however, seemed neither surprised nor impressed. Forgery, he said quietly, is the homage that falsehood pays to faith. Tell me, Baron, who forged this resemblance so well, and why must the illusion be maintained? The Baron hesitated, as though afraid to know the answer himself. There were 2 men, said the Baron after a moment's silence, whose duties placed them in proximity to the mask. The first, our courier Herr Drexler, carried it from Vienna to London under sealed authority. He was found 3 days later in his hotel room, dead of what the physician termed apoplexy, though no cause was evident. The second, a restorer named Hoffmann, examined the piece upon arrival. He too is dead, drowned in the Thames near Chelsea Bridge, his body marked by a blow behind the ear. The police were told it was accident. It was not. As he spoke, his voice quavered between grief and apprehension. Holmes's eyes had grown keen and sharp, though his manner remained tranquil. 2 deaths to preserve a deception, he murmured. That is too high a price for art, but not perhaps for ambition. The Baron lowered his gaze. Then you understand why I came to you, Mr. Holmes. The mask is only the surface of a deeper shame. For a time, Holmes said nothing. He studied the Baron's face with the same meticulous scrutiny he might devote to a cipher or specimen under glass. I could see his mind at work, the eyes narrowing, the lips pressing into that peculiar half-smile which I had learned to associate with discovery. You wear English gloves, Baron, said he at last, but your overcoat is cut by a Viennese tailor. The faint varnish upon your right sleeve. That is no accident. You have handled a sealed wooden crate, perhaps within the last day. Von Lutz started, his composure breaking for an instant. You see, Watson, Holmes continued calmly, our visitor is not merely a messenger of this affair. He has touched the very object in question, or its counterfeit. There is guilt here, but not his own invention. It is borrowed guilt, the sort that comes from obedience to a corrupt master. The Baron's silence was admission enough. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, gazing for a long moment at the fog that drifted across. Baker Street. Baron von Lutz, he said at last, truth is a dangerous commodity, and the manner of its unveiling may destroy as much as it redeems. If I take this case, it will be upon one condition, that no whisper of it escapes to the embassy, the press, or your superiors in Vienna. The Baron inclined his head gravely. You have my word. Then you shall have mine, Holmes replied. I will find your mask, and, I suspect, the face that hides behind it. He extended his hand, which the Baron took with a look of weary gratitude. The moment lingered. 2 men bound by understanding rather than trust. The Baron took his leave soon after, his heavy footsteps fading down the stair. I followed to the window and saw his figure emerge upon the pavement below, momentarily illuminated by the street lamp before the fog devoured him entirely. Holmes joined me there, his expression thoughtful, detached. You observed his tremor, Watson? I did, I replied. A man shaken by guilt, perhaps. By association, not deed, said Holmes quietly. Still, it leaves its echo, a faint vibration of hidden guilt. We shall hear it again before long. Outside, the fog thickened until the lamps glowed like pale moons through gauze. Within, Holmes returned to his chair, the firelight playing across his face. "The Empire," he murmured, "casts long shadows, even as far as Baker Street." And so began the case of the Silver Mask of Vienna. When I descended to breakfast the following morning, I found Holmes already at the table, surrounded by a small avalanche of newspapers. His teacup sat forgotten, and his sharp grey eyes travelled from column to column with the precision of a man deciphering a cipher rather than reading mere newsprint. "You will observe, Watson," he remarked without looking up, "that the world continues to turn, but always upon the same invisible axis. Vanity." He tapped the Times with his finger. "Here, for instance, the Austro-British exhibition to open in 10 days. A single line, buried among railway strikes and parliamentary gossip. Yet this trifling notice carries a thunderclap within it." I leaned forward. There, indeed, was the brief announcement. The exhibition at South Kensington would display a selection of artifacts from the Imperial Collection of Vienna, chief among them, the Silver Mask. Holmes's silence carried more weight than any headline could convey. The Baron's tale of theft had seemed to me, at first, a matter confined to diplomats and curators. But the more I considered the matter, the clearer it became that this silver relic bore the weight of 2 empires' pride. Holmes, pacing before the fire, spoke quietly. "These exhibitions, my dear Watson, are less about culture than control. To lend a nation's treasures is to lend its confidence, a delicate gesture between rivals, too polite to speak their mistrust aloud." The Silver Mask, he explained, was not merely an ornament. It was the centerpiece of the exhibition's goodwill. A gift centuries old, a symbol of royal reconciliation after war. And now, with its loss concealed by a forgery, the veneer of diplomacy shone as falsely as the counterfeit mask itself. "One theft, Watson," Holmes murmured, "and a continent trembles beneath its own reflection." Later that afternoon, Holmes dispatched a telegram through the Foreign Office, a favour owed from some forgotten intrigue, and by evening received a sealed packet in reply. I watched as he opened it with evident satisfaction. "The records of the original gift," he explained, "a treaty sealed in silver." The documents detailed that the mask had been presented to the Austrian Emperor by Britain's King George II in 1740, a gesture to mark the end of trade hostilities. Each monarch had sworn to keep peace, so long as the mask remains whole. Holmes smiled faintly. "Symbolism, Watson, has longer memory than politics. If the mask were broken or lost, men of superstition might call it an omen." He leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "Yet it is not superstition that concerns us. It is intent. Who profits from a scandal that must not exist?" Holmes spoke little for the remainder of the day, save for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers upon the arm of his chair. "There is artistry in this crime," he said at last. "No vulgar thief could have conceived it. The replacement is too perfect, the silence too absolute. The criminal acts not for coin, but for conscience, or revenge." I ventured that it might be the work of political radicals, those who thrived upon chaos and exposure. Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson. Revolution is a noisy instrument. This is the work of a craftsman, one who cuts precisely where the heart beats strongest. There is vengeance in precision." He rose, his expression taut with thought. "Whoever orchestrated this affair did so not to steal, but to teach. The question remains, whom does he mean to instruct?" Our deliberations were interrupted by the return of Baron von Lutz, whose countenance bore the weary strain of a man aging by the hour. He refused tea, sat stiffly, and answered Holmes's inquiries with the diplomacy of evasion. "I regret, Mr. Holmes," he said, "that I can furnish little more than what I have already confessed. The embassy is delicate at present." Holmes observed him closely. "You speak as one who fears not accusation but exposure," he said softly. There is a difference. The Baron's eyes flickered. I am bound by my office, he murmured. Holmes inclined his head. And yet, Baron, the truth binds you more firmly still. The Austrian rose abruptly, thanked us with forced politeness, and took his leave. Holmes watched him depart, his gaze unreadable. He fears not disgrace, Watson, he said quietly, but revelation. The two are rarely the same. When the Baron had gone, Holmes withdrew to his desk, where he spent an hour sketching circles and lines upon a blank sheet of paper. Vienna, he said, is a nest of alliances, political, financial, personal. Observe. He traced names and titles upon the sheet. Count Adlerstein, curator of the Imperial Collection. Herr Weissmann, industrialist. Baron von Lutz, liaison. Each tied by a single thread, the Restoration Fund, from which the mask's restoration was financed. I leaned closer. You think the crime stems from within the committee itself? Holmes nodded. A message, Watson, not to the public, but to those who feasted upon corruption. Someone has stolen the symbol to expose the sin. He folded the paper carefully. This crime was not committed against the Empire. It was addressed to it, a letter signed in silver. That night, the fire burned low, and the fog pressed thickly against the windows. Holmes sat motionless, his eyes upon the dancing flame. Consider it, Watson, he said at last. A theft too quiet, a forgery too flawless, two deaths too convenient. This is not the plundering of treasure. It is the retribution of ideals. He turned toward me with that faint glimmer of intellect that always heralded revelation. The theft was not of silver, but of illusion. The mask has merely changed owners. What was truly taken is the Empire's reflection of itself. I could find no words in reply. Outside, a carriage rolled past, its wheels hissing against the wet cobblestones. Holmes leaned back, the shadow of a smile at the corner of his lips. Tomorrow, he said softly, we go to Vienna. There, I think, the truth waits, and it will not wear a mask. It was on a grey afternoon, discreet and unannounced, that we left London behind us. Holmes had insisted that we travel under assumed names, he as Mr. Grey, and I as Dr. Hammett, a precaution that I accepted without question. There was in his manner a quiet urgency, a determination that the fewer eyes upon us, the better. We spoke little during the drive to Charing Cross. Holmes's lean features, half concealed beneath a travelling cloak, betrayed no trace of excitement. Rather, it was the intense calm of a mind wound tightly upon purpose. Diplomacy, Watson, he said once, as the platform came into view, is only the art of concealing danger behind etiquette. As the train steamed southward, the spires of London receded into mist. It struck me then that this was no mere journey of investigation, but an entry into a political labyrinth, one whose corridors we could neither map nor predict. Our passage across France was long and strangely silent. Holmes, seated opposite me in the narrow compartment, seemed absorbed in some private meditation. His gaze lingered upon the shifting fields beyond the window, bare trees and winter villages passing like thoughts unspoken. Once, as we approached Calais, he stirred. "Observe, Watson," said he, "how swiftly man imitates what he admires. We borrow manners, architecture, even morals, until the imitation becomes indistinguishable from the original. That, if you will permit the metaphor, is the first mask ever worn." He smiled faintly, yet there was no humour in it. The border formalities at Dover had passed without incident, and by evening we were bound for Paris. The rhythmic clatter of wheels filled the air, yet beneath it I sensed another pulse, that of Holmes's mind, silent but awake, weighing patterns invisible to all but himself. It was somewhere between Paris and Strasbourg that Holmes's quiet turned to alertness. We had just finished our supper of bread and coffee when he glanced toward the compartment door. "Do you smell tobacco, Watson? Not the common English blend, but a heavier leaf. Balkan, perhaps." A tall stranger had passed twice through the corridor, pretending to read a newspaper printed in German. His eyes, however, had flicked toward our seats each time. Holmes's attention sharpened. "A Viennese journal," he murmured. 2 days old. Our friend travels faster than his news. When next we looked, the man was gone. At the following stop, a porter confirmed that no passenger had disembarked from our carriage. Yet on the seat where he had sat, Holmes discovered a thin trail of ash and a faint odour of Turkish tobacco. He pocketed the fragment without comment, but I saw in his expression the unmistakable spark of pursuit. "Our journey," he said, "is already observed." By the time we reached Munich, the air had grown sharp and brittle with frost. The train halted for a customs inspection, and we were herded with the other travellers into the waiting hall, a cavernous chamber echoing with the murmur of multilingual complaint. Holmes, outwardly indifferent, leaned against a pillar, his eyes roaming with the detachment of a hawk above a flock. "Do you note the pair of clerks near the stove?" he whispered. "Their papers are too neat, their hands too idle. They are not travellers, they are watchers." The two men conversed in low tones, yet their gaze returned repeatedly to a sealed diplomatic case resting upon a luggage cart. "Austrian embassy," Holmes observed softly. "Our mystery travels in company." When the train resumed its journey, Holmes's demeanour remained unchanged, but I could tell he had added another thread to the growing tapestry of his deductions. Later that evening, as we crossed the Bavarian countryside, Holmes and I took our supper in the dining car, a modest affair of cold meats, cheese, and a thin wine whose taste neither of us praised. The lamps swayed gently with the motion of the train, and outside, the darkness pressed like velvet against the glass. Holmes broke the silence. "Civilization, Watson, is a veil stitched by restless hands. We pride ourselves on progress, yet beneath it lie the same passions that ruled man when he first learned deceit. Vienna, Paris, London, the capitals differ only in costume." He smiled, but it was a weary smile. "Do you not find it curious that refinement so often breeds corruption? The finer the mask, the fouler the face it conceals." I offered a mild protest, but he waved it aside. "Forgive me. The case infects my thoughts. When men of culture deceive, their crimes are carved with precision." It was near dawn when we arrived in Vienna. The great station, with its glass canopy and marble pillars, gleamed faintly in the early light. Beyond its arches stretched a city both magnificent and uneasy, a realm of music and intrigue, of chandeliers and shadows. We drove through broad boulevards where the gas lamps still burned against the retreating night. Everywhere there was grandeur, yet beneath it an undercurrent of tension, the unspoken anxiety of an empire aging beneath its own splendour. The air itself seemed perfumed with contradiction, coffee, tobacco, and the faintest trace of decay. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes, as our carriage passed the Ringstrasse. "A city where beauty and secrecy dance the same waltz. Every facade here smiles, and every window listens." I could not shake the feeling that we had entered a theatre where the curtain had just risen, and the players already knew their parts. The station's bustle had nearly subsided when a uniformed porter approached Holmes and handed him a folded note. There was no signature, no seal, only a single line written in a firm yet elegant hand. "The mask still smiles, but not for long." Holmes read it twice, then tucked it into his pocket. His expression hardened, though his voice remained calm. So, the game announces itself. Outside, the first strains of a military band drifted faintly from a nearby square, mingling with the hum of awakening carriages. Holmes turned toward me. "Watson, I should be surprised if we were not being watched this very instant." He signalled for a cab, and as it carried us into the awakening streets of Vienna, the golden light of morning caught the brim of his hat, glinting like a blade half drawn. "Our adversary," he murmured, "prefers elegance to haste, and I intend to match him note for note." The following morning, we were received at the Imperial Museum, a vast edifice of marble and shadow, whose echoing halls seemed to preserve not merely relics of empire, but the pride that had gathered them. We were conducted by a uniformed attendant through a corridor adorned with statues of Roman emperors, each one regarding us with blank serenity. At the end awaited a man of middle years and remarkable bearing, Count Adlerstein, curator of the imperial collection. His movements possessed the quiet authority of one accustomed to power disguised as etiquette. "Mr. Holmes," he said, inclining his head with restrained warmth, "Vienna owes much to your reputation, though I trust it will never require your services again." Holmes bowed in return. "I fear, Count, that history has never consulted reputation before repeating itself." A faint smile touched the Count's lips, yet his eyes remained as cold as the polished floors beneath our feet. The Count was a study in composure. His voice, though soft, carried with it the precision of command. His gestures were economical, as if each movement were measured for effect. I have seldom met a man whose courtesy suggested such deliberate calculation. He was tall, immaculately dressed, and of that pale Teutonic complexion which in certain lights can appear almost marble. Yet beneath this polished exterior, I detected something sterner. Not arrogance, but conviction. His gaze, once fixed upon a subject, did not waver until it had extracted the last fragment of meaning. Holmes, who had been studying the Count as one might an unknown specimen, remarked lightly, "Your collection must be both a privilege and a burden, Count." Adlerstein inclined his head. "An inheritance, Mr. Holmes, and, like all inheritances, it demands a conscience strong enough to resist temptation." Holmes's glance at me was faint, but unmistakable. The battle, I knew, had begun. We followed the Count through long galleries filled with treasures that glimmered beneath the filtered light of Vienna's pale morning. Swords, manuscripts, chalices, the remnants of centuries compressed into silence. Adlerstein moved among them with the grace of a man walking through his own memory. "Each piece," he observed, "bears the echo of hands that once believed themselves immortal. Now they are dust, and their pride survives them only in metal and stone." Holmes appeared to listen, though his gaze wandered to the Count's hands. Elegant, uncalloused, yet betraying the faintest trace of silver beneath one fingernail. He said nothing. As Adlerstein led us toward the central hall, I noticed how his steps slowed before a gilded reliquary and again before a jeweled chalice, each an emblem of faith corrupted by power. "History," Holmes murmured to me, "has an unerring instinct for irony." And then, before us, loomed the empty case. The glass cabinet stood beneath a domed skylight, its velvet lining immaculate, and utterly bare. Adlerstein stopped abruptly, then turned toward us with what struck me as an almost theatrical composure. "Here," he said, "stood the silver mask of Vienna, a symbol of our empire's endurance, and now a symbol of its vulnerability." Holmes regarded the case without reply. His eyes traced the faint outline of dust upon the velvet, the subtle indentation left by long display. "You seem singularly familiar with its former position," Holmes remarked at last. "I should almost think you had rehearsed this lament." The Count's lips curved in a faint smile. "Perhaps I have, Mr. Holmes. We curators must anticipate loss. It is, after all, the natural end of all collections." "Indeed," Holmes said softly, "yet some losses are more deliberate than natural." The Count's smile did not falter, but his eyes darkened perceptibly. From that point, conversation turned from ceremony to combat. Holmes, with that disarming courtesy which often preceded his sharpest deductions, spoke of the difficulty of preserving truth in objects so easily imitated. "Truth," Adlerstein replied, "is never found in the object, Mr. Holmes, but in the eye that beholds it. A perfect imitation is, in essence, perfection itself." Holmes inclined his head. "Then the artist who deceives us refines reality by distortion?" "Precisely," said the Count. To copy beauty is to understand it better than its creator. The counterfeit is the philosopher of art. Holmes's voice dropped an octave. Or its executioner. For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed Adlerstein's face. You speak as a moralist, Mr. Holmes. As an observer, replied Holmes calmly. Morality is the lens through which we decide whether beauty reveals or conceals truth. Adlerstein's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. It was during this exchange that the Count made his first and only misstep. He turned toward the empty case once more, and in speaking of the mask's loss, said quite casually, to reproduce such purity of alloy, that particular silver-copper balance, would require a craftsman of the highest skill. Holmes, who had been resting one hand upon his cane, froze as subtly as a clock whose mechanism has halted mid-tick. You are well informed, Count, he said gently. The composition you describe was never made public. Adlerstein's eyes flicked to him and away again. A curator's curiosity, nothing more. Holmes smiled faintly. Curiosity has been known to ruin empires. For an instant, the silence between them was palpable, like a thread drawn taut. Then Adlerstein inclined his head, his calm restored. Vienna thanks you for your interest, Mr. Holmes. If I may offer you tea. But Holmes's eyes had already taken their final measure of him. As we departed the museum, the Count bowed with the same impeccable composure that had greeted us. His courtesy was perfect, and utterly without warmth. Outside, beneath the pale noon light, Holmes drew on his gloves with a small, deliberate motion. We have met the craftsman, Watson, he murmured, though his tools were moral, not metallic. I glanced back through the tall glass doors to where the Count still stood, his figure framed against the marble gallery like a statue in vigil. You believe him guilty? I asked. Holmes's expression was unreadable. Guilt is a matter of law, my dear fellow, but complicity, that is an art, form. We walked on in silence, our steps echoing across the courtyard. Somewhere within the museum, a clock struck noon, precise, impassive, and mercilessly punctual, much like Count Adlerstein himself. Holmes had long since exhausted the official reports, the statements, and the gossip of the embassies. It was in a more modest document that he at last found the thread he required, a small sketchbook taken from the murdered restorer's desk. The pages were filled with designs of masks and ornamentation, yet beneath each graceful curve lay faint pencil figures and dots, arranged with a precision that could not belong to mere doodling. He sat bent over it for nearly an hour, his fingers tapping the table in rhythm with some private calculation. At last, he closed the book softly. Coded measurements, Watson, and directions to an address. Observe this pattern. It traces the flow of the Danube itself. Our craftsman's secret lies by its banks. Within the hour, we were descending from our lodging toward the river, the Viennese dusk settling like smoke upon the city. Vienna's grandeur receded behind us as we passed into its older quarters, where the cobblestones were slick and uneven, and the air hung with a mingled scent of damp stone, fish, and decay. The lamps here burned dimly, their light refracted in puddles and gutters. I could hear the slow lap of the river somewhere ahead, though the narrow lanes twisted so intricately that one might have believed them designed to confound pursuit. Holmes walked swiftly, his gloved hand brushing the walls as though reading their texture. This is the city's true face, Watson, he murmured, where culture drains into secrecy. Note the windows, shuttered from habit, not from night. A cat darted across our path, and somewhere a door closed with quiet finality. At length, we came upon a cul-de-sac that ended against the dark gleam of the Danube. A single house stood there, its sign faded to a ghost of letters. The building was low and broad, its facade discoloured by years of river fog. A rusted hook hung above the doorway, and upon the weathered lintel one could still decipher the faint trace of a trade emblem, a mask-maker's sign. Holmes examined the door closely, his lantern's narrow beam revealing scratches near the lock. "Recent," he murmured. "A man who locks in haste betrays the fear of discovery." He knelt, touched the keyhole with his lens, and smiled. And yet, the artistry persists. Even deceit leaves its signature. Art leaves traces, even in deceit. A quick motion of his instrument and the lock yielded. The smell that greeted us was one of iron, oil, and something older, a faint metallic sweetness that clung to death and labour alike. Holmes stepped first across the threshold, his shadow lengthening into the gloom. "Careful, Watson. This house has not yet decided whether it will reveal or conceal." Within, the gloom resolved into shapes, workbenches, plaster moulds, a litter of chisels and tongs. Dust lay thick upon everything, yet the air retained the oppressive heat of recent occupation. Holmes's lantern swept across a shelf lined with silver fragments, each beaten thin as paper, others fused together by careless flame. "Behold the anatomy of a lie," he said softly. "Here lies the ghost of the original mask, replicated stroke by stroke under compulsion." On a side table rested a half-finished cast, its features delicate but marred by a single dent upon the cheek. Holmes touched it gently. "A craftsman's rebellion," he murmured. "Even under threat, the hand betrays the conscience." Every surface bore evidence of work abruptly halted, as though the master of this room had been seized mid-creation. From the back room came a sound, faint, irregular, a laboured breath that broke the stillness. Holmes motioned for silence and moved toward the partition. There, upon a narrow cot, lay an old man whose ashen face was streaked with blood. One hand still grasped a file, the other a rag of silver leaf. His eyes, clouded but aware, turned feebly toward us. "Who did this?" I whispered. Holmes knelt beside him, examining the wound. A puncture low in the ribs, deliberate, precise. "He has been left to die slowly." The man's lips moved. I leaned close and caught a whisper, hoarse and fragmentary. "He came, the gentleman. He wore it, himself, before the paint was dry." His breath rattled. Holmes took his wrist gently. "The gentleman. Who was he?" But the man's gaze drifted upward, as though following something invisible above the ceiling beams. A tremor passed through him, and a faint smile, half terror, half wonder, crept over his face. Holmes bent closer, his voice low and urgent. "You must tell me, man. Who wore the mask?" The dying artisan's mouth trembled. A final whisper escaped, faint, almost lost in the crackle of the lantern flame. "He wore it himself," and the mask smiled. The last word hung in the air like the echo of a curse. His fingers twitched once, then fell still. For several moments, neither Holmes nor I spoke. He remained kneeling, his profile thrown into relief by the thin light. When he rose, there was an expression upon his face I had seen only a handful of times, the mingling of comprehension and disgust. "The case, Watson," he said gravely, "has ceased to be a question of theft. It is now a confession, executed in silver." He replaced the lantern's cover and turned toward the door. "Come, we have seen the workshop of truth. Let us now see the theatre of guilt." We emerged once more into the open air. The twilight had deepened into that peculiar half-light that lingers upon the Danube, where silver merges with shadow. The river moved sluggishly beneath its crust of mist, reflecting the dim lamps of the city like a procession of fallen stars. Holmes paused, upon the embankment, gazing across the current. "The river," he said quietly, "knows more of man's vanity than all his empires. It carries away his triumphs and his lies alike, and leaves only silt." I glanced back toward the shuttered house. From within came no sound, only the faint glimmer of our extinguished lantern. Holmes drew his coat close. "We are dealing, Watson," he murmured, "not with a thief, but with a man who sought absolution through deceit. And such men," he added, "never wash clean, not even in the Danube." Together, we turned from the river, and the mist swallowed the house behind us. Holmes's plan for that evening was executed with the precision of a seasoned conspirator. Through one of his innumerable contacts, a certain attaché whose gratitude he once earned by saving him from diplomatic ruin, he secured our admission to the imperial ball at the Hofburg Palace. Our names, of course, were fictitious. I was presented as a visiting physician from Edinburgh, while Holmes, with his usual flair for irony, styled himself as Professor Vernet, a supposed connoisseur of antiquities. As he adjusted his cuff before the mirror, Holmes remarked lightly, "The theatre of manners, Watson, is often the stage of crime. Observe them well tonight. The gestures, the glances, the silences. They are the dialogue of deceit." His tone was half in jest, but the sharp gleam in his eyes betrayed the hunter's instinct beneath the veneer of civility. And thus, under borrowed names and borrowed smiles, we entered the gilded facade of empire. No scene I have witnessed, even in the courts of London's nobility, equalled the splendour of that night in Vienna. The Hofburg blazed with chandeliers that scattered light like shards of crystal across polished floors. The air shimmered with perfume and the rustle of silks. Diplomatic uniforms gleamed beneath the golden ceiling, medals clinking softly like the chains of mutual flattery. Yet beneath the laughter and the swirl of dance, there ran a subtle current of tension, a kind of nervous brilliance that betrayed the fragility of peace. The empire, it seemed to me, glittered precisely because it feared the dimming of its own light. Holmes, impeccable in evening dress, surveyed the assembly with eyes half-lidded, his manner that of a scholar mildly amused by human folly. "A ball, my dear Watson," he murmured, "is merely diplomacy in rhythm." I could not help but feel that every smile around us was rehearsed for survival. We moved through the ballroom incognito, unnoticed amid the shifting brightness of uniforms and jewels. The masquerade theme of the evening gave ample cover to our deception, for guests hid their identities behind painted masks, as if each feared to meet himself in another's gaze. Holmes's attention wandered from group to group, a countess whispering too intently to a military attaché, a banker bowing with the humility of a thief before a prince, an artist whose eyes never left the glittering neckline of a duchess. "Observe," Holmes murmured, "how corruption and charm waltz in perfect time." I noticed that he lingered whenever a conversation turned toward the embassy or the exhibition. "Every falsehood," he said softly, "creates its own echo. Listen long enough, and one begins to hear the source." Then the orchestra began to tune once more, the hum of conversation falling to a hush as the opening strains of a waltz filled the air. As the violins rose and fell in the familiar rhythm of the Kaiser waltz, I found myself drawn into the hypnotic pattern of the dancers, a sea of colour revolving beneath a ceiling of gold. Holmes, however, stood apart, his gaze fixed not on the beauty of the scene, but upon its contradictions. "Do you see it, Watson?" he asked. "Every bow, every step, every smile, choreographed. The empire dances to the illusion of its own harmony, yet the very precision of its movement betrays the strain beneath." His eyes followed a cluster of diplomats near the dais. "Look there, 3 men laughing, but one laughs a half-second late. That is the rhythm of deceit." The orchestra swelled, drowning conversation. It was then that Holmes's posture changed, his back straightening, his attention narrowing like the lens of a camera. Something, or someone, had caught his eye. Holmes's hand tightened upon my arm. "There, Watson, near the mirrored column." Following his gaze, I beheld a figure gliding effortlessly through the dancers, tall, elegant, draped in black and silver. The man's face was hidden behind a gleaming mask of polished silver, so radiant beneath the chandeliers that it seemed almost to cast its own light. My breath caught. I knew instinctively that I was looking upon the stolen artifact itself, the silver mask of Vienna. Count Adlerstein, for it could be no other, moved as though the entire ballroom were his stage. The guests, admiring the splendor of his attire, laughed and applauded the audacity of his costume, never suspecting the enormity of the secret it bore. Holmes's expression was unreadable. He parades his guilt in plain sight, he murmured. The thief wears his confession as a crown. I felt the room grow colder, though the music played on. At that instant the Count turned his head. Across the expanse of dancers, his masked gaze met Holmes's unflinching stare. The music swelled, yet all sound seemed to fade between them. I saw in that silent exchange a recognition that transcended words, not merely adversaries, but equals locked in the symmetry of intellect and irony. The Count inclined his head ever so slightly, as one duelist salutes another before the first stroke. Beneath the mask's expressionless silver, I could almost imagine the faint curve of a smile, one of defiance, perhaps even triumph. Holmes's lips barely moved. He challenges me. He whispered. The fox walks openly before the hound. Then, with a subtle movement, Adlerstein joined the line of dancers once more, his figure absorbed by the turning throng, as if the waltz itself had swallowed him whole. When the final note of the waltz died away, the Count was gone. No trace of his silver visage remained among the swirling gowns and gleaming medals. Holmes did not pursue. He stood motionless, his eyes scanning the crowd with a calm that belied the intensity of his thought. "He vanishes not by escape," he said at last, "but by blending perfectly into his own illusion. There are crimes so elegant that only truth can pursue them, and even truth must dance to their rhythm." We left the ballroom soon after, the echo of music still trembling through the corridors. Outside, the night air felt sharp, cleansing, and yet heavy with questions. Holmes looked back once toward the glowing windows of the Hofburg. "He wore his guilt as art," he murmured. "And art, my dear Watson, is the one disguise even conscience admires." The carriages clattered away into the fog, carrying with them the memory of that glittering deceit. The palace had long since emptied of its revellers. The corridors, once bright with chandeliers and music, now lay dim and echoing, haunted only by the tap of our footsteps. Holmes moved ahead of me, silent and deliberate, following the faint rustle of silk and the almost imperceptible gleam of silver vanishing around a distant corner. We entered a narrow gallery, where portraits of emperors and consorts loomed above us, stern, painted visages gazing down as though presiding over some eternal tribunal. Candlelight trembled upon their gilded frames, and the air carried the faint odour of wax and age. At the far end, beneath a marble arch, stood Count Adlerstein. He turned slowly, his silver mask catching the light like a fragment of moon. For a moment neither spoke. The living and the painted dead seemed to hold their breath alike. Holmes's voice, low but clear, broke the stillness. "You chose your theatre well, Count. These walls have seen truth buried under grandeur before." It was a duel in every sense but name. Holmes and Adlerstein faced each other across the polished floor, their voices the only weapons permitted. The Count's bearing remained impeccable, calm, courteous, and untouched by fear. Yet there was, beneath that poise, a kind of fatal serenity, as though he had long prepared for this moment. "You followed me," he said quietly. "I followed conscience," Holmes replied, "though yours, I suspect, has taken an unfamiliar road." Adlerstein's gloved hand brushed the mask. "Do you intend to strip this from me, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes's smile was faint, almost melancholy. "Not I, Count. You have already begun to remove it yourself." For a time, they stood thus, two intellects meeting in silence deeper than argument. The flicker of the candles seemed to pulse, with the rhythm of their unspoken contest. It was Adlerstein who broke the spell, his voice softer now. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, you shall hear the truth, for what it is worth." The Count removed the mask and laid it upon a marble plinth. Its gleam dulled in the candlelight, like gilt losing its polish. His face beneath was pale and composed, but his eyes shone with a feverish light. "I commissioned the forgery," he said, "not for gain, but for exposure. The silver mask was to be unveiled as a symbol of the Empire's virtue. Yet its restoration had become a vault for vice. The committee charged with its care siphoned the funds meant for artisans and lined their own coffers with the gold of the public purse. He paused, running a hand through his hair. I resolved to show them the true reflection of their empire, a perfect imitation, made not of honor, but deceit. When the mask was revealed, they would gaze upon their own hypocrisy and call it art. Holmes regarded him steadily. A dangerous morality, Count. You forged not silver, but the truth itself, and truth is a fragile metal. Adlerstein's confession flowed now with the fervour of one long silenced. He spoke of nobles who, beneath the pretense of patriotism, had turned devotion into trade, of contracts given to cousins and mistresses, of sums vanished into administrative necessities. The Restoration Fund, a supposed beacon of imperial pride, had become little more than a conduit for corruption. When I learned, he continued, that the true craftsmen were starving while bureaucrats dined upon their labour, I resolved to act. I replaced the genuine mask with my counterfeit, exact to the last curve. When the original disappeared, they would scramble to conceal the theft, and in doing so, expose their deceit. The forgery was my indictment, written not in words, but in silver. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the portraits above. History, Count, has a long memory for irony. You forged justice and found only ruin. Adlerstein smiled faintly. Perhaps ruin is the only honest verdict left to us. Holmes listened without interruption, his profile half lost in shadow. When the Count's voice faltered into silence, he spoke at last. Truth, when worn as disguise, said he, corrodes the face beneath it. The lie, however noble, will always outlast its justification. Adlerstein inclined his head gravely. And yet, Mr. Holmes, it reveals what justice cannot. Would any court have condemned those men? The Emperor himself would have dined beside them tomorrow, none the wiser. My crime, if it be one, is that I sought to make deceit visible. There are revelations, Holmes replied, that illuminate nothing but the ruin of their author. The Count met his gaze. Then I am content to be ruined. I felt the weight of the silence that followed, not the silence of victory, but of understanding. Between these two men there existed, for that brief moment, an accord more binding than forgiveness, the recognition of intellect divided by conscience. At length, Holmes turned away from the plinth. Count Adlerstein, he said quietly, your confession, though damning, shall find no ear but mine. I have no wish to be the instrument of your destruction. Adlerstein regarded him in surprise. You would let me go? Holmes's expression was grave. Not without penalty. There are crimes the law cannot punish, but the conscience always will. Leave Vienna tonight. Go where your name bears no echo. But carry this with you, that in seeking to unmask corruption, you forged your own. The Count bowed low. You offer exile in place of justice, Mr. Holmes. I accept both. He turned toward the arched doorway, pausing only once to glance back at the silver mask. Tell your England, he murmured, that not all art deceives. Some merely tells the truth too beautifully to endure. Holmes inclined his head, and the Count departed without another word. We watched from the gallery's end as Adlerstein descended the grand staircase, his figure diminishing into shadow. Dawn had begun to seep through the high windows, casting a thin, cold light upon the portraits of emperors. Holmes remained motionless beneath the marble arch, his gaze fixed upon the plinth where the silver mask rested, serene, inscrutable, reflecting his face in miniature. No truth wears well, he said softly. It tarnishes, like silver, when touched by the hands of men. There was something in his tone, not pity, nor condemnation, but a weary comprehension of human frailty. I wished to speak, but the hush of that vast hall restrained me. The mask seemed almost to shimmer in the pale light, as though mocking all who had sought virtue in its likeness. Holmes turned at last. Come, Watson. The ghosts of empire have had their confession. As we stepped out into the courtyard, the sky over Vienna had paled to the colour of pewter. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, faint and far away, a waltz drifted from an unseen window, the same melody that had played when the Count wore his silver face. Holmes paused to listen. "Fitting," he murmured. "Even the Empire insists upon its encore." We walked in silence through the deserted streets, the echo of the music following us like a memory one cannot quite dismiss. Neither of us spoke again until we reached our lodging. That night, I wrote in my notebook only this: the mask was never truly stolen. It merely changed the face that wore it. Our return from Vienna was marked by a silence that weighed more heavily than the snow upon the passing fields. Holmes sat opposite me in the railway carriage, his gaze fixed upon the frozen landscape that unfurled like a pale scroll beyond the glass. He neither smoked nor spoke. From time to time, the faint rhythm of the wheels seemed to echo the measured cadence of his thoughts. There was no triumph in him, nor the faintest trace of disappointment, only that peculiar stillness which followed his encounters with moral paradox. The train moved through the lowlands of Germany, through France, and at last toward the Channel, the grey sea awaiting us like an old confidant. When at last we reached Dover and felt the damp English air, Holmes drew his collar close and murmured, "Strange, Watson, how the nearer one comes to home, the farther one feels from certainty." It was under that same pall of uncertainty that we entered London the following morning. The familiar fog hung over the city like a veil unwilling to be lifted. Yet for all its gloom, I confess I felt a curious comfort in the sight. The narrow streets, the rattle of hansom cabs, the faint tang of coal smoke that spoke of hearths and habitation. Holmes, ever laconic, offered no word until our cab drew up before the black door of Baker Street. He paused on the step, glancing toward the sluggish sky. "After Vienna's splendour," he said softly, "our London looks almost honest." Mrs. Hudson had kept the rooms as we had left them, the armchairs by the fire, the violin resting upon its case, and the faint scent of tobacco in the air. To the world beyond, life continued as before. But for us, something unseen had shifted, as though conscience itself had altered its hue. I lit the hearth, grateful for the hiss and crackle of flame that restored warmth to our long cold sitting room. Holmes set down his travelling case and opened it with his customary care. From within, wrapped in a fold of linen, he withdrew a small fragment of silver, dull at its edges, yet gleaming faintly where the light touched it. "The last remnant of the mask," he said quietly. "A symbol, perhaps, of the truth it sought to reveal. Imperfect and incomplete." He placed it upon the table beside his pipe. For a while we watched the firelight play across its surface, the gleam waxing and waning like a pulse. "There is something of irony here, Watson," he mused. "Men polish silver to reflect their worth, yet tarnish returns inevitably, as does guilt." He said no more, but I could see that the object weighed upon him more than any victory of logic ever could. It was late in the evening before Holmes spoke again. He sat in his accustomed chair, the faint glow of the fire striking across his face. "Adlerstein," he began, "was not a villain in the usual sense. His was a crime conceived not in greed, but in the pride of righteousness, a subtler poison, and a far more perilous one. I ventured that perhaps his motive, if not his deed, was deserving of sympathy." Holmes regarded me steadily. "Sympathy, yes, but not absolution. To fight corruption with falsehood is to join the very ranks one condemns. The Count unmasked his empire, yet in doing so he destroyed his own soul. He mistook deception for justice, as if truth could be moulded by clever hands." He leaned back, his gaze drifting toward the fragment on the table. "And yet," he added, almost to himself, "I have known far baser crimes to bear nobler intent." With his usual precision, Holmes rose, took the piece of silver, and placed it upon the mantelpiece above the fireplace. It gleamed faintly, amid the clutter of chemical retorts and dusty monographs, a quiet relic of a matter that had tested not merely his intellect, but his moral balance. Empires too wear disguises, he said, and sometimes, Watson, the mirror must be shattered to see the face beneath. Adlerstein merely hastened what time would have done more gently. He folded his arms, his eyes following the flicker of reflection upon the shard. The irony, he continued, is that the empire he sought to expose will remember him not as an accuser, but as a thief. History, like silver, prefers its tarnish to its truth. For a long while, we stood in silence, the fire crackling softly, a fragile sound in the hush of moral reckoning. It was then that I noticed, not for the first time, a rare weariness in my friend. Not the fatigue of intellect, but of spirit. His face, half lit by the fire, bore that expression of inward struggle which he was careful to conceal from all but myself. "You look troubled, Holmes," I said. He smiled faintly. "I have no right to be otherwise. We have witnessed a crime whose punishment will never appear in the Gazette and whose justice may yet lie beyond human measure." I considered his words in the quiet that followed. For all his brilliance, there were moments when I suspected that Holmes's greatest battles were fought not against criminals, but against his own reflections on morality. Outside, the wind rose softly against the panes, carrying with it the faint, distant hum of London. "Perhaps," I murmured, "it is not justice that men seek, but peace." Holmes did not answer. He only stared at the shard above the fire. The clock struck midnight. The last embers glowed within the grate, painting the room in deep, shifting amber. Holmes spoke at last, his voice low and even. "Some crimes," he said, "cleanse the conscience of nations, though they blacken the soul of men. Adlerstein will wander, nameless and unhonoured, yet in the quiet corridors of power his act will whisper still. A reminder that false virtue is but guilt refined." He rose, adjusted the fragment upon the mantel, and stepped back. The firelight caught its edges so that it shone like a sliver of moon. "We live in an age of masks, Watson," he continued, "but even the truest disguise cannot survive the gaze of time." I recorded those words later that night, though I doubted I could ever capture their weight. Holmes had turned again to his chair, his face half in shadow. Outside, the city slept beneath its endless veil of fog, and within our rooms only the fire moved, flickering gently across the silver shard, until even that, light too, surrendered to the dark. The last embers glowed upon the hearth as Holmes leaned back, his eyes fixed on the faint gleam of silver resting upon our mantel. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "truth is not always the ally of virtue. Count Adlerstein sought to unmask deceit and, in doing so, became its most perfect craftsman. Some crimes purify by exposure, yet they scorch the soul that commits them." He paused, the firelight flickering across his face. "A strange world, my dear fellow, where even honesty must sometimes wear a mask. Tell me, what do you believe was Adlerstein's gravest sin? His deception, or his belief that justice could ever be born from a lie? Share your thoughts below, subscribe for more of Holmes's curious cases, and pass this mystery along to anyone who still believes silver never tarnishes.